Great. Hello and welcome, everybody. I think there will be a few more participants joining us over the next couple of minutes, but let's go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to this webinar today, which is all around the launch of the methodology report for the Nature Positive Transitions Pathways programme for the UK economy. So my name is Charlie Dixon, and I am Programme Director for Nature at the Green Finance Institute. And I have had the pleasure of working with colleagues at both WWF and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology over the last 9 months on this programme and on specifically developing this methodology, which we're going to share with you today. So really our aims of today's webinar are we want to break down some of the technical detail about how these pathways will be developed over the next few years. But we also want to show you how businesses and financial institutions in the UK have already been helping to shape this methodology. So we've already had lots of input. And we also want to spend a bit of time talking about how those private sector actors and government actually are going to use the pathways once they're developed a few years down the line. So just before we jump into the content, a few elements of housekeeping. You might want to put your Zoom into speaker view for the best experience. So that should make sure that you see all of the right people at the right time. Today's webinar is going to be recorded just for your information, and the recording will be available on our website. And given the number of people that we have on the line today, we've disabled microphones and also the chat function, but we encourage everybody online to submit questions through the Q&A function on the screen. So you should see a Q&A a button on your controls. And there you'll be able to submit your own questions, but you'll also be able to see questions that have been submitted by others. So if you see a question you like, you can click the upvote button, which looks like a kind of upwards arrow. And that would demonstrate that more and more people want that question to be answered, and we'll make sure that we get to the questions that are most popular. So you see a question you like, please click the upvote button. So with that, let's get started and take a look at the agenda for today. So we're going to start with just providing a little bit of context over the programme as a whole. So what are nature positive transition pathways? What are they trying to achieve? And where's the background of this programme? Where's it come from? And what have we been, or what process have we been following up until the launch of this methodology report today? Then colleagues at the UK CEH, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, are going to take you through some of the technical detail of the methodology itself. So you'll really get to understand what's under the hood of how these pathways are actually going to be developed. And then we're going to be bringing a few of the users of the pathway into the conversation. So we're going to be speaking to KIR, we're going to be speaking to Federated Hermes and also DEFRA, all around how they hope to use the pathways once they're developed. And then hopefully that should give us a good amount of time at the end for lots of questions from the audience as well. So as we go through the presentation today, please do continue to post your questions in that Q&A function. So the context. Starting with kind of why nature positive transition pathways, what are they really trying to help with? And the context for that today really is that there's a huge number of countries around the world that have signed up to national and global targets related to nature under the Global Biodiversity Framework. And so these targets cover lots of different things. They cover lots of different pressures on nature. They cover nature restoration. They cover mobilization of finance for nature. But what's missing from this framework is a really clear delivery mechanism. So in particular, you have these global targets, and in some cases, those have been translated into national targets, like we have, for example, in England in the Environmental Improvement Plan. But what they don't translate to is really clear actions for businesses, for financial institutions to say, what does it look like to be aligned with those targets? How do I know that I'm contributing? And so we neither not know what those specific actions are, nor do we know what's the kind of conditions that we would need. So what policies might we need? What regulatory environment might we need? What financial environment might we need to make sure that those actions actually make sense for businesses too. So this isn't just about kind of laying out what needs to happen. It's also laying out how we get there too. So those incentives and that policy environment. And so without this information, it's going to be really difficult to actually deliver these targets and drive action on the ground. So that's exactly where the pathways come in. And really what they try and do is marry both the scientific approach to make sure that we're scientifically thinking from a robust framework what actions will actually lead to delivering those pathways, but also from a practical perspective. So the actors and the businesses that are actually going to have to do a lot of this action on the ground, what's feasible and how do we make sure that it makes sense for them. And so that's kind of where pathways comes in, trying to bridge these two different camps. So what might they look like? This is just a very coarse illustration of what a pathway potentially could look like to give you an idea for the kind of look and feel. And what you'll notice immediately is what we're trying to do here is very much take a leaf out of the climate playbook. So in the context of the UK, nature positive transition pathways are very much going to look and feel like net zero transition pathways. And that's what you've got on the slide in front of you. So on the right, you have net zero transition pathway across lots of different sectors in the UK from the sixth carbon budget published by the UK Climate Change Committee. And you can see it demonstrates how emissions across lots of different sectors are going to have to reduce over time, including sequestration as we get further on out to time in order to overall meet the UK's net zero target. And so on the left, you have an illustration of what this could look like for nature. And so here, the example that we have chosen is around nitrogen emissions. And so you can imagine perhaps the sectors that would contribute to those the reduction in nitrogen emissions across the UK might be agriculture, water, and construction and real estate, so the built environment. And so this kind of pathway is going to demonstrate what does that reduction in emissions look like for each sector over time, and how together that leads to the achievement of a target, the UK's national nature targets, further out into time, so potentially out to 2050 or other time horizons. And so for all of these, how do we decide kind of what sits in that pathway? So what actions do we actually need? It's going to be a combination of lots of different things, but not only technically what's needed to reduce emissions or restore land or whatever the target might be, but it's also practical things like how much are these different actions going to cost? Do they involve replacing assets which already exist in the UK at the moment, and we need to think about when they come to the end of their natural lifetime? Do we have the right supply chain? Do we have the right actors within supply chains? Do we have the right skills? So all of these things that we're going to try and take account of during this process and during this analysis. So what have we done to date? So currently we're in the scoping phase of this programme, and this scoping phase has been funded by a combination of DEFRA as well as NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council. And there have been a couple of different milestones over the course of the last 9 months. Around about summer last year, there was a statement of support that was published from about 35 different businesses and financial institutions in the UK, demonstrating their support and their demand for this programme. So they're thinking through, what does my long-term corporate strategy look like? And how do I know if I am aligning with government ambition, with policy direction, with these really important kind of overall directional signals? And so they're really interested as they're thinking through the investments they're going to make. How can I better align with those? And pathways are a really, really useful way to do that. And we're going to hear more about that later on when we speak about the use cases. But so all of these businesses said within the statement, we would find this as a helpful tool to help us with that long-term planning. And later on in the summer last year, there was mention of pathways in a couple of different consultations that the UK government put out. And there was also a report between GFI and WWF that looked at lots of examples of where businesses were already investing in nature and really seeing some strong economic and financial returns from that. And it's important when we talk about investing in nature, we define this isn't just about nature restoration. It's also about all of the different things that will have to happen across all sectors of the economy to reduce business impacts on nature. So that's going to look like new technologies, new products, new business models as well. And then at the end of last year, the UK government also published its revised version of the environmental improvement plan. And within this revised version, there was a commitment of the UK government to work with WWF, UKCEH, and GFI on the development of these pathways, initially focusing on three sectors: so agri-food, built environment, and the water sector. And that kind of takes us up to the technical work that's happening under the scoping phase. And so really this is doing two things. The first thing is bringing together part of the stakeholder structure that's going to feed in and make sure that these pathways are both grounded in science and they're grounded in the practice of what things look like for businesses on the ground. And so to do that, we've formed a series of business working groups that focus on those three sectors that I've just mentioned. So there's one for agri-food, one for water, one for built environment, as well as an advisory group. And what these groups are doing are providing input into and feeding back on several of the technical outputs that are going to come from the scoping phase. So there's the technical methodology report, which we're talking about today. Within that, there is also the prioritization of which targets the pathways might focus on. So in England, that's environmental improvement plan targets and beyond. And then it's also thinking about, as we go into the rest of this year, developing what we're calling a sample pathway for the agri-food sector. And this sample pathway isn't going to be the final pathway. It's really a test of this methodology that we're talking about today to make sure from a technical perspective, the models kind of line up together and the methodology stands up in practice. So these are the main three kind of phases that we've been engaging with these groups, and we've had regular meetings with them over the past 9 months. So we've really tried to make sure that that feedback has been inputted and kind of hardwired into this process. And so a lot of the material that you'll see in the methodology report, the decisions that were made, and the kind of choice of focus and the choice of scope of the pathways are hopefully reflecting lots of this continued engagement with both that working group and also the advisory group over this timeline. Then looking towards the end of the year, as you see here on the bottom right of this slide, where this is going to kind of move from now until the end of the year is the continued development of a sample pathway for the agri-food sector, as I mentioned, which will be published in late 2026, alongside an academic paper, which will go into more of the detail around how this has been developed and is kind of suited more to an academic audience as well. So who's in these groups? And what we really tried to do when we were bringing them together was to make sure that they were representative of the whole value chain across these sectors. So we've tried to think about lots of the different actors that are important within each sector, and also the different types of businesses. So both thinking about not only private sector businesses themselves, but also the financial institutions that are either lending to or investing in those businesses, actors within their supply chain, as well as trade associations, to make sure that the views of some of the smaller businesses and the SMEs that are really important in these sectors are being taken account of as well. And so, for example, in agri-food, in the agriculture space, it's trying to make sure that we have coverage across all of the different important types of commodities. So the producers of lots of different grains, of different types of meat products, as well as horticulture too. In built environment, it's not just thinking about construction and contractors, it's also thinking about consultancy. It's also thinking about the developers themselves, so the companies that own the assets, as well as the supply chain and materials. And in water utilities, it's also thinking about the kind of design and engineering partners that go with the water utilities and the infrastructure programs that they have too. And the advisory group is a place predominantly for organizations that sit across all of those sectors as a whole. So there's academic organizations in there, there's arm's length bodies, as well as business membership organizations and financial institutions that have portfolios that span across all of those sectors too. So that gives you an idea of who's in those groups specifically. And these are the organizations that have really been at the heart of providing the input that shaped this methodology. And so what have they actually inputted? They've helped think through what should different exploratory pathways focus on. So what are the different versions of the world that we might want to explore before deciding on what a final kind of optimal pathway would look like? We've talked a lot about targets, which targets are the most important, which targets are the most business relevant. So how do I actually have influence over those? And which do we think should the pathways focus on? We've talked about scope. So which parts of the value chain should be in scope and should be out of scope? And again, where do you have influence over? And we've also spent a lot of time talking about actions. So a first view of what different actions businesses across these sectors could take. How, to what extent are they already implemented today? And how ambitious could the scale up of those actions be in the future? And if so, under what conditions? So this is all the types of feedback that has been provided. And so with that, I will hand you over to Anita from UKCEH to give you a bit of a flavour of what has been done with all of that input and what the methodology looks like. Over to you, Anita.
Thanks so much, Charlie. Hi everyone, my name's Anita Lazurko. I'm a senior transdisciplinary scientist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and I'll be presenting our technical methodology today on behalf of a much larger team of scientists. So that includes Nick Isaac, Paula Harrison, Eva Lurk, Henry Grubb, Lisa Giacelli, and many others, including the folks at the Green Finance Institute and WWF. So first, I'll kind of start with some of the overarching principles that were guiding our approach. First, we are co-creating the pathways with the business community, financial institutions, and a wider range of stakeholders in the same way that we tried to co-create this methodology to try to ensure the pathways are actionable, relevant, and reflect a wide range of perspectives and knowledge in the sectors. And at the same time, they are evidence-based. So we are using the best available data and methodologies. That means we're using a rigorous modeling approach and really sense checking and validating important assumptions that we're making in the process against literature and expert judgment when we need to. And finally, we're adopting an iterative learning approach with the idea that these processes are highly complex, and it is very unlikely, if not impossible, for us to generate any sort of perfect pathway the very first time. So we will go through an initial co-creation process with the business community and stakeholders to generate proto pathways, which are kind of interim draft pathways that explore particular uncertainties, which we will then evaluate and model to see whether they achieve our desired outcomes. We will bring the results of that modeling and evaluation process, which will reveal important learning about trade-offs, shortfalls in ambition, or other effects, to another round of co-creation with business communities and stakeholders to generate our final pathway, which we will then evaluate and model again for dissemination. So we're co-creative, we're evidence-based, and we're embracing this iterative learning approach. And so within those guiding principles, I'm going to walk you through a few aspects of the methodology that are detailed in the report. I'll first talk through the scope, which includes our system boundaries that really define what's in and what's out of the pathways. I will walk you through the pathway framework, including the type of actions and options we're going to explore as building blocks for those pathways to get to our final nature positive transition pathways. I'll then talk about the priority impacts and outcomes the pathways are meant to achieve. So what does success look like? So this includes how we're measuring impacts for, quote, nature positive, and also beyond to other outcomes that define this desirable pathway. And finally, I'll walk through the methodology we're going to use to model and evaluate the pathways. And so that's really when we're testing if they're achieving those desired impacts and outcomes that I'll have defined. Okay, so what's in and out of our pathways? First, our spatial boundary is the UK, with our focus primarily on defining actions and quantifying impacts on nature domestically. We will consider the risk of offshore impacts abroad, interpreted from our models quantitatively when we can, but also evaluated in other ways where we can't. We have aligned to the England Environment Improvement Plan, as Charlie mentioned, because this scoping phase was part funded by DEFRA, and alignment to the policy landscapes in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland will rely on their engagement in that full program. We will model the pathways in a spatially explicit way, and that means we'll look at particular changes in particular geographic locations, and that really allows us to reflect how local environmental conditions and the local aspects of biodiversity influence these outcomes. However, we will be aggregating our outputs nationally, and that allows us to maintain this flexibility in implementation when this goes out for implementation in the business community. And finally, we're developing and modeling the pathways to the year 2050 with implementation of actions in 5-year time steps and the outputs as an annual time series. So we can compare those outputs against years of target achievement and kind of the rate of change. And what's in and out of the sectoral scope? So we know that all three of our sectors, the agri-food, water utilities, and built environment sectors, have very complex value chains with many different impacts and dependencies on nature. So in the report, we've included a list of priority economic activities included in our sector scope alongside this kind of diagram like you see here. And that was done based on a mapping of sector activities from the Encore database and feedback from our working groups. And it's just important for us to note that the actions and impacts of these economic activities in our scope will be considered in the pathway co-creation, in the actions, and in the evaluation, but they won't necessarily all be quantified. So just something to keep in mind. And so importantly, beyond defining the scope of the pathways, we need to understand what the pathways themselves are. What are the building blocks or actions in these pathways, and what's the overall framing? So we're defining pathways as combinations of actions sequenced over time to achieve a particular goal. And so in that definition, actions really form the building blocks. And so the report includes a synthesis list of actions that we derived from existing industry reports that really form the starting point of the pathways. And they've been mapped to the IPBES business and biodiversity framework and sectoral value chain activities so we can kind of contextualize them in the wider landscape. And if you take a look at them and you feel like something's missing, please note these are non-exhaustive. So we are going to further elaborate and enrich these lists of actions when we get to the co-creation in the main program. And what's the overall framing that guides how these actions are sequenced and combined to form a pathway? That's what our pathway framework does. The report includes how we're defining the alternative pathways that will be explored during the co-creation process. And these reflect different priorities, preferences, and assumptions about how, why, and under what conditions change may occur. And this pathway framework emerged out of working group discussions where we explored a number of options that have been done before in different processes and from literature. And we landed on this as really getting to the heart of some of the key uncertainties for the sectors. And so in the first iteration of pathway co-creation, we will use 3 proto pathways that test different assumptions about why change is occurring. So our market-driven proto pathway assumes action is enabled primarily by market forces, as investors, insurers, lenders, and businesses themselves really recognize the financial implications of nature risk and opportunities associated with the transition to nature positive outcomes. And that's contrasted with the consumer-driven proto pathway. And in this pathway, we assume that action is driven by a widespread sociocultural or value-based shift where consumers are recognizing the importance of nature. And that's really shifting consumer demand away from products and services that negatively impact the environment and toward those that can demonstrate positive impacts. And the third is the policy-driven proto pathway, which assumes that businesses are enabled through supportive changes in the policy landscape. So, for example, new financial incentives or regulatory obligations. And alongside these, we've got our current trends scenario. And so by exploring and isolating the particular drivers of change in each of these scenarios, we can identify the opportunities and limitations of business and action enabled by single drivers of change, and therefore opportunities to leverage synergies for a system-wide transition. So we'll bring all the learning from those proto pathways into iteration 2, where we will co-create a collaborative balanced pathway that leverages synergies and identifies this credible and achievable route to delivering national nature targets through coordinated action. Okay, so what are these actually meant to achieve? What are our priority impacts and outcomes for the pathways? Well, first and foremost, they are meant to transition the sectors toward nature positive. We see this as aligned with the Convention on Biological Diversity's mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and achieve a world living in harmony with nature by 2050. And this mission, as Charlie mentioned, is operationalized through the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and national targets such as England's Environment Improvement Plan. So our approach will develop these pathways that contribute to a nature positive future by aligning with these target-based frameworks with this assumption that actions that together achieve these targets will contribute to a nature positive future. And it's important to note that aligning to these target-based frameworks is policy relevant, it's also practical, but that means that some ecological outcomes might receive less priority, so things like habitat connectivity or ecosystem functionality. And I think that's important for future work. And also, unlike climate science and our net zero transition pathways, biodiversity is highly local, so it's not mixed like it does in the atmosphere. And different units that we use to measure outcomes for biodiversity, like species abundance or connectivity, they're not fungible like a CO2 equivalent. So our outputs from this process will paint a more complex picture than net zero transition pathways, but we'll do our best to still make them actionable and offer some clarity and guidance. And as was already mentioned, government support for these pathways in the UK has enabled alignment with the national nature targets. So we've developed and tested that with England's EIP because the scoping phase was part funded by DEFRA. And so the report also identifies priority targets from the Environment Improvement Plan for each sector based on their relevance to the sector and the sector's potential to influence them. And that prioritization process emerged from both working group discussions and a mapping of pressures from economic activities in each sector from the NCORE database. And so that prioritization will hopefully help guide sectors toward pathways that will address their most important impacts and dependencies in a relatively complex landscape. So the pathways also need to achieve outcomes beyond nature positive for them to be desirable and coherent with wider sectoral transition. So we are actively aligning the pathways to the climate agenda, and we'll do that in three ways. We will evaluate the contribution of the pathways to net zero by modeling their implications for residual emissions in the carbon sink. We will align the pathways to the UK net zero transition pathways by making some key shared background assumptions consistent with the CCC balanced pathway, and also comparing levels of ambition for different actions. And we will assess the climate resilience of the pathways when we can. Beyond impacts on nature and climate, we also know that business impacts and dependencies on nature and these pathways will have broader impacts, including socially. And so the report includes an initial list of indicators we'll evaluate against related to human rights and labor standards, social risks and opportunities, shared responsibility, etc. And this will be refined. This list of indicators will be refined in the early phase of the main program. And finally, we need these pathways to be viable for businesses. And so the working groups highlighted some key criteria that would meet success criteria essentially for the pathways. And this is in order of priority on this slide. So we have the cost effectiveness versus alternative actions, supply chain readiness, regulatory requirements, implementation potential and scalability, technology readiness, lifetime of existing assets or planned asset replacement timelines, whether we have the relevant skills and capacity, and the longer term resilience benefits. So that's what the pathways are trying to achieve, which is ambitious. And we are going to then evaluate whether we do that through this evaluation and modeling process. And to do that, we have kind of a two-part mixed methods approach. The first is we're using an integrated modeling pipeline that draws from an interdisciplinary set of models and approaches to quantify the impacts of the actions that are implemented within the pathway that can be modeled on the targets that we're trying to achieve. And at the same time, we know that not everything can be quantified in a single set of models. So we will do a semi-quantitative evaluation based on review of relevant literature and expert judgment. And I'll just talk you briefly through both of those. So instead of relying on one model alone, which would be limited in the amount of complexity we could consider, we've combined complementary models to trace impact across interconnected systems. And so we have an integrated modeling pipeline that's going to evaluate the impacts of actions as model inputs on measurable environmental changes linked to the global biodiversity framework and national targets as outputs. And we've developed a common modeling pipeline for all three sectors so that we can look at some of the interactions across them. The models that are in the pipeline were selected from over 60 models that we looked at through an iterative model review that we assessed the models according to a bunch of key criteria that would meet what's required for this project. And importantly, not all actions and impacts can be quantified, and especially these effects in really complex global supply chains are difficult to capture. And that's, of course, a product of needing to make some choices to scope this properly, but also that the data, models, and evidence required to do so is kind of an ongoing question in the scientific community. So we're going to try to contribute to part of that, but we won't fully answer it within the scope of this approach. And in the report, there are some details on the integrated modeling pipeline, including a transparent methodology for how we're going to translate what will be qualitative actions into quantitative model inputs or model parameters. We have a detailed model pipeline and descriptions of our models, including some of the inputs and outputs that flow through them. We've mapped the actions to our model inputs to show that we can represent a large majority of the actions in our modeling pipeline. And we've also mapped our model outputs to the targets we're trying to measure against to show that we can speak to achievement of some of these goals. And so for the non-modeled actions and impacts, our semi-quantitative evaluation will assess pathways for more approximate estimates. So instead of a particular number changing over time, which our integrated modeling pipeline will show, it will give estimates like low, medium, high. And we do that using literature-informed expert Delphi method. And if you're not familiar, it's kind of an established iterative way of gaining consensus on a complex issue across a wide group of experts. And so we'll use this method to assess our non-modeled impacts. And those are listed in the report. For example, any non-modeled priority targets, the social impacts we've listed, some of the risks of offshoring impacts abroad that we cannot determine from our models, etc. And so finally, we will be assessing the business viability, and that will have multiple steps. We will analyze costs and benefits to compare the transition against a business as usual and apply a CCC-inspired cost-benefit methodology. We will model investment cases, and we will value risk reduction, including avoided climate and nature-related losses and increased resilience. And in cases where the pathways business viability is in question, we will identify changes in enabling conditions in the policy landscape, for example, that are required so that businesses can adopt the level of ambition that are in these pathways. So that was a whirlwind tour of a more comprehensive report, and I hope I've brought across a bit of our proposed approach. So that includes the co-creation and engagement we want to implement to ensure the pathways are actionable and relevant to the sectors. We're going through these two iterations of co-creation, modeling, and evaluation so that we can learn from new insights to arrive at this balanced pathway. And we're drawing on evidence, making sure we're using historical data, current trends, and the best scientific literature to make this scientifically robust. And I'll just close with saying that we don't expect these pathways to be final and to dictate exactly how things will go. They're intended to evolve over time as evidence, data, and technology improve, and also as change occurs in the sectors. So they should really be viewed as living tools that can support decision making and investment planning rather than any sort of fixed blueprints for implementation. So thank you very much for your time, and I will pass it back to Charlie.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anita. So we've now had a really good look into the detail of the methodology. So we know how we can potentially develop these pathways in the future. So let's kind of look at the other side of the coin and think once those pathways are developed, how might we be able to use them? And in particular, thinking of the different stakeholder groups that could use them as well. So on the next slide, I would love to invite up to the screen and three speakers that are going to talk a little bit about this. So we've got Ben Stone, Group Head of Environmental Sustainability at Kier Group, Sonia Litzman, Stewardship Director at Federated Hermes, and Neha Dutt as well, Head of Nature Risks and Opportunities at DEFRA. So representing three different stakeholder groups. And I would just love to hear from each of you, kind of what do you want to see from the pathways? What can they deliver for you? And how would you like to use them in an ideal world? Maybe Ben, we'll start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. Been great to be part of the working group. I think Anita's just given us a real feel for why this is a complex topic, but really important for the built environment sector. So I think I've got sort of maybe 2 points to make on this. It might just take me a little while to go around it on sort of talking about the built environment. So I don't think anybody's been a kid anybody on this call and say that the built environment isn't responsible for some big impacts on nature. So we put a lot of concrete in the ground, putting it really bluntly. But equally, we've got some really big opportunities to support nature recovery. So Kia as a business, we build homes and schools and hospitals, transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure. We look after water infrastructure and renewable energy projects, and all of those require land and materials. And that's not going to change. So, we need more of all of that stuff. And sometimes the priorities for those projects will have nature as the primary outcome, like the picture behind me. So lower otter restoration project is a salt marsh that we built for the Environment Agency. But a lot of the time, it'll have different priorities. That might be green space for communities to improve well-being. It might be delivering renewable energy to help reduce our carbon emissions. It might be better affordable homes or schools or hospitals. So all of that makes it really complicated to work through all this. And there will be trade-offs. So Anita talks about trade-offs. We can't have our cake and eat it anymore. If we want to cut carbon emissions, sometimes there will be a nature impact. If we want to restore nature, sometimes it will come at the expense of some carbon emissions. And we need the nature positive pathways to help guide us through that and make sure that we're making informed decisions and trying to get the best outcomes we can. The second point, which Anita also sort of touched on, is that nature is complicated. So carbon is complicated enough, but we're kind of getting our head around that as a sector, and we're able to work out what our emissions are. Nature, you have to look place-based. You have to think about habitats and species and ecosystem services and water and waste and air quality and resilience and access to green space, human well-being. All this stuff means that sometimes businesses in our sector have a bit of a scattergun approach. So we try to do a little bit of everything, and that kind of undermines the impact. And a good example, I think, on that is air quality. So I talk to our stakeholders quite a lot, whether they're investors or shareholders or our clients. And when we talk about air quality, they tend to focus on tailpipe emissions. And that's right, we use a lot of diesel, but that's a tiny air quality impact for us. So our biggest air quality impact across our sector is dust. And climate change and the hot weather that we've had recently is really pushing that up the agenda and making it worse. So if we have a project where we've taken all the vegetation off to do some groundworks and it's got clay soils, that produces huge amounts of particulate matter, which is less than 2.5 microns. And that is the size of particle that will bypass all the filtration going into your lungs. So if we've got sensitive receptors around our project, we need to focus on that. The nature positive pathways, for me, it's all about making sure that there's some common understanding that dust is a bigger issue than tailpipe emissions for our sector. So that when we're talking to stakeholders and businesses are focusing on key issues, we are all pushing in the same direction. So I think that the biggest bit, really, just to sum it up in one sentence for me, the reason that I'm really excited about this is that it helps us to identify the sort of strategic direction we need and then tell us as simple-minded environmentalists and construction businesses what is the practical action we should all be focusing on to do better.
Amazing. Thanks, Ben. I think that point around prioritization is so important. And nature's huge, it's so complex. There's gonna have to be so many points through this process, which we do prioritize. We've already come up against that, because even if you look at either the GBF or the Global Biodiversity Framework or the Environmental Improvement Plan, there's loads of targets in there. So there's no way that you can look at all of them. So we need to be thinking which are the most important we think are to start with. And then once you get to those, which are the most important actions, not every action you can possibly take, which are the most important ones that we can get there. There's loads of stuff I could pick up on, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep us moving. And Sonia, over to you for the investor view, please.
Thanks, Charlie, and hello, everyone. Firstly, congratulations to all the partners for the publication of this methodology, a really key step in the process. And like Ben, it's been great to be involved. I think as a starting point, we need to look at why this work is so important. And that goes to how fundamental nature and healthy ecosystems are to economic stability, resilience, and competitiveness. And clearly, we need to run the economy in a way that recognizes that and respects that. And a key part of that is transitioning sectors of the real economy along those pathways. So these pathways are really that practical, tangible way in which we can help transition sectors of the economy. So I think it's really valuable work. And Charlie mentioned at the start the Global Biodiversity Framework. Target 14 of that framework actually calls for the mainstreaming of nature in decision-making across economic sectors and across different levels of government. So it's brilliant to see the UK lead on how we can actually actualize that target and that mainstreaming approach. In terms of the specific use cases, so firstly, I think the policy insights that we'll get from these pathways are going to be really important. Businesses and investors need the enabling policy environment to create confidence, clarity in the market. And so, these pathways might point to where are some of the technologies or solutions that need more incentivization to scale up and to grow, to become cost competitive. And on the contrary, what are some of the things that should be banned or should be disincentivized? Looking at that whole context as well. So I think the role of the pathways in creating an enabling policy environment is really important. For investors, I think there are several dimensions as well. Firstly, it's really highlighting where some of those opportunities are. We've got an indication. There's precision agriculture, there's circular economy solutions, there's a whole range of things. But I think these pathways can really add credibility, scientific, economic backing to show some of the scale of these opportunities and to Ben's point, some of the priorities. Where should we be looking? And that can be really important, again, for the confidence and the clarity point, but also for capital allocation, innovation in products, and so on. And another really key dimension is to inform investor stewardship. I work in the stewardship team, so I'll focus a bit on that area. We engage with companies, have active dialogue on behalf of our internal funds and also on behalf of an external set of institutional investor clients. And that's covering over 2.3 trillion of US dollars of assets under advice. Nature is a priority topic, so we're engaging with companies across sectors and across the world on topics like water, deforestation, the agricultural transition, and so on. But there are challenges at the moment. For example, how do we know if a company is transitioning quickly enough? Is it transitioning in line with what the science is calling for? Is it adequately addressing some of the financial and economic risks of nature degradation? And critically, how does that company compare to some of its peers? So again, the pathways can really help to answer some of these questions, can help to provide clarity about the direction of travel and how individual companies fit into that. So I think as next steps, it's really important that we make these pathways as practical and tangible and grounded as possible. We've heard that a few times on the call already. Also to link up to the climate pathways, which Anita outlined clearly. And I think on top of that, to link to the economic and the industrial strategy. That's an approach that's worked very well for the climate pathways. And so the more joined up we can have that thinking, the better. And then this key point about how can we take what's worked in the UK and share it internationally so that we can develop national pathways in other countries, but also perhaps international nature pathways, given how complex and interdependent supply chains are. So I'll stop there, but again, thank you very much to the partners for all of this work and really looking forward to the next steps.
Thank you, Sonia. And what a wonderful segue into the government perspective. The one thing I will interject with just before you do come in, Neha, is this point around capital mobilization is really key. So we spent the beginning of this webinar talking about the fact that this could be the delivery mechanism for GBF targets. What does delivery mean? It means private sector action and it means private sector investment. And so looking across to climate, for example, the UK net zero economy attracted 20 billion pounds of private capital in 2024. And you look at the role that net zero transition pathways had within that. One of the things, for example, to pick out that the pathways recommended, contracts for differences, hugely influential in the renewables market. It's helped kind of the technology mature from those early stages, and things like the cost of offshore wind come down from about £170 per megawatt hour to about £37. That's a huge difference. So that's exactly those kind of policies that you were talking about, Sonia, that we want to see the equivalence of in the nature space. And Neha, over to you.
Thank you, Charlie, and a big thank you to GFI WWF and UKCEH for reaching this really important milestone. So I want to start off by saying that today the reality is that no matter where in the world we live, despite all the breaches in planetary boundaries, governments are still fixated on economic growth. That's a kind of existing problem statement. So we need to work within the framing of that narrative. And so it's worth asking, what if the greatest constraint on economic growth over the next 50 years isn't a lack of capital, talent, or technology, but a lack of reliable, clean water, healthy, resilient soils, thriving, standing, diverse forests and oceans, a lack of nature? Because for decades, we've treated nature as an environmental issue to be half-heartedly protected on the fringes of the economy. But nature isn't a fringe issue, as we know. It is the foundation of every economy, every sector, and every supply chain. And yet we rarely manage it as if it were critical national infrastructure. And that has to change. So now that governments around the world have set these really ambitious international targets to halt and reverse nature loss, we have to realize that targets alone don't create investment, and that's what you were pointing to, Charlie. They don't tell businesses how to transition, and they don't provide investors with the confidence that they need to deploy capital in aligned directions. So we are hoping that the nature positive pathways work will play that crucial translation function to decode international, national level targets into practical, actionable steps organizations can take to transition towards a more future fit footing. And we're hoping that they will really help unpack three simple questions. Number one, what needs to change? Number two, who needs to act? And number three, where are those biggest opportunities for resilient economic growth within that sector? And it's also worth mentioning that although NPPs may initially focus on water, food and agri in the built environment, the opportunity is far broader because every sector depends on nature. Take fashion, for example. Up to 90% of an apparel's raw materials come from nature: cotton, wool, leather. They all rely on healthy soils, fresh water, and thriving ecosystems. Take pharmaceuticals. Around 80% of modern medicines are derived from plants and microorganisms. So nature really is that engine of medical and innovation. Or consider our digital economy. Semiconductor manufacturing requires hundreds of thousands of liters of ultra pure water for chip fabrication. And without secure water supplies, production slows, supply chains tighten, and the entire, it has a ripple effect across global industries, given how reliant we are on chips. So these examples all point to the same conclusion, that nature isn't really another sector of our global economy. It is that underlying operating system that every sector relies on. And that's why nature positive pathways, in our minds, are not simply an environmental framework, they are an economic one. So we in the UK government are looking to NPPs to help us align our industrial strategy, our net zero and environmental improvement plan targets to ensure that regulation, innovation, infrastructure, and investment all flow in that same direction. And so we're really grateful to all of you, at GFI, WWF, and UKCEH for the brilliant work you're doing, because it's slowly creating those widening pools of awareness that the defining and inevitable transitions of this century, they're not separate challenges. For example, the transition to net zero, the transition to a nature positive economy, the transition to resilient economic growth are one integrated transition. And a transition that overlooks nature or tries to sidestep it will struggle to deliver lasting resilience. And equally, restoring nature without transforming the economy will never achieve the scale of change required. So it's worth mentioning that there's a massive first mover advantage here, because countries that recognize the opportunities in adopting NPPs first, they won't simply be protecting biodiversity. They will be strengthening their supply chains. They will be attracting aligned private investment. They'll be accelerating triple bottom line innovation and building much more resilient, competitive economies. And that's why the UK government is supporting the development of NPPs, both through policy leadership and through funding. And we really encourage other governments to explore how NPPs could be integrated into their own economic growth calculus. And every country will take a different route, but a clear pathway can help align environmental ambition with economic policy and provide confidence for private investment, to unlock that resilient, inclusive long-term prosperity that we all will depend on. So to conclude, I'd say that perhaps the question isn't whether we can afford to invest in nature, given all the various fiscal constraints and budgetary constraints. The real question is, can we afford to build the economy of the future without the natural systems on which it depends?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Neha. Very compelling. And your point on that this isn't just about nature restoration, it's also about looking at the transformation across every sector of the economy. I spotted in the Q&A that someone said, how does this all link to that stat that's kind of going around or making the rounds at the moment, that for every pound invested in nature, there's 30 pounds invested in things that are destroying nature or creating a negative pressure on nature in some way. And I guess that's exactly your point, right? That these pathways are simultaneously about how do we increase the £1 and how do we reduce the £30 as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it points to the need for making the case that the markets are already innovating towards solutions that don't require us to destroy nature. And if you look at all the transition technologies that are coming out now, there isn't a need to, for example, pollute waterways if we have that innovation and technology in place to perhaps generate, additional revenue streams from that sludge and untreated sewage that could have been poured into rivers. So there is a movement that's already underway. And we just need to make such a compelling sort of awareness around it so that it really reduces the 30 pounds for every pound spent.
Perfect. Well, on that very hopeful note, let's move over to our Q&A. So Ben, Sonia, Neha, please stay on camera. And then I'll also invite up Anita and the rest of the UKCH team as well, and WWF to help answer some questions. I see our favourite question of the day at the moment in the Q&A is around alignment. So are the pathways aligned with the Nature Positive Initiative definition and state of nature metrics? I think, Vasilis, you had an initial thought on this. Do you want to take this and then anyone can build on that?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. And thank you for the question. So the definition is, as Charlie said earlier, our analysis is guided by the environmental improvement plan as a starting point. So these are the metrics used for measuring each target in the environmental improvement plan is towards how we're gearing our analysis towards. And the metrics of the state of nature metrics that NPI has produced are largely aligned with some of the metrics used for different in the environmental improvement plan's targets. So for instance, the species extinction risk is relevant to the target in the environmental improvement plan on species abundance, and then there's IUCN Red List and so on. So largely they're covered and the metrics will be similar. It's a good flag that we can sort of highlight this. Like for instance, currently we are highlighting how different EIP targets are relevant to different EBES pressures for nature loss. So we can do something similar for state of nature metrics as well to show where these overlaps happen. But in terms of definition, that's something really important to highlight here, is that, we are operating on the assumption that the environmental improvement plan and the global biodiversity framework are sufficient to deliver the nature positive transition that is required. It could be argued to what extent this is true, and I think this is something that will be highlighted in our analysis. But this is for something that we need to acknowledge when it comes to definition, that the pathways are there to help us achieve the targets that have been set in place in the EIP and potentially the GBF and the other devolved nations targets. So back to you, Charlie.
Perfect. Thanks, Vasilis. And there's a cluster of questions that are quite related to this, actually. Some people have asked about metrics. So what metrics will the pathways use? Some people have said, is it focused on state of nature or is it focused on impact pressures? So the drivers of nature loss. Several of those are answered, but I thought for the benefit of those who haven't seen those answered, does someone from UKCH kind of want to cover that cluster?
Yeah, I can jump in. So yeah, thanks for those questions. And it's a chance to say some more details that I couldn't fit in my 15 minutes. So the way that our modeling pipeline is set up is that we have kind of two model types. There's a modeling pipeline with a bunch of different models, but there's two modeling types. One of them we're calling driver models, which is essentially modeling the impacts of actions on these drivers of biodiversity loss or these pressures, like was asked in the question. And the second type of model is the biodiversity models. And those are measuring things like changes in species abundance. And we're linking those together so that we can kind of go all the way from an action implemented to impacts on biodiversity at the other end. So I think that does kind of frame a little bit of how far we're trying to get with this, and that we are kind of measuring both. And some of the targets in the Environment Improvement Plan are measuring changes to pressures in a way, and some of them are measuring delivering to impacts that improve the state of nature. So it's just kind of both and, I suppose. Maybe I don't know if anybody else from UKCH wants to add anything or.
I mean, just really very briefly related to some of the other questions in the Q&A box is it's not a single metric, I think, is that the other thing to emphasize. It'll be a whole basket of different metrics, some related to drivers and some related to biodiversity. And some of those will be modeled, and then those that we can't model will be assessed through literature and expert-based methods. So again, this will be a whole range of things in terms of drivers related to things like land use pressures, pollution, resource extraction, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of abundance, habitat extent, and quality to the degree that we can do. And then what we can't do through modeling, we will assess in other ways. And part of what those metrics are will also come through our analysis of the indicators that are important for the targets in the GBF and the different policy frameworks of the four governments of the UK when they come in the co-creation process. And that will be part of that co-creation exercise.
Excellent. Thank you. And there's another selection of questions, again, around the same subject. And so lots of people asking, how did we decide on these three sectors? So how did you end up with agri-food, built environment, and water? And then also, what's the applicability? How transferable is this to other sectors and other geographies? I'll maybe answer a little bit on the choice of the sectors, and then whoever wants to jump in. I think, Vasis, it'd be interesting to hear what's going on in other countries as well. But in terms of the choice of the initial three sectors, and they are exactly as kind of Neha and the whole team have said, they are initial sectors, and really we do need to be taking a whole economy approach. It's simply an answer of you have to start somewhere. You can't do everything all at once. And so these are three sectors that were identified as having particularly high impacts and dependencies on nature, particularly high relevance to the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the EIP, and also a lot of intersection in the solutions that they might have, so the actions that they might take to deliver those targets. So it just made sense as a kind of a logical first cluster for us to focus on. But by no means this is the end of the journey. And so that kind of the application to additional sectors down the line is really important. Vassilis, did you want to talk a little bit about other geographies as well?
Yeah, so we are hoping that the work that we're doing here in the UK, like this methodology we're presenting and everything, can be used as a template for other countries and could be adapted into different geographies. And we started experimenting with that. So we're now working on a pilot with the Wageningen University in the Netherlands and the Dutch Ministry of Environment. We are trying to look into how, for instance, pathways could be developed there. There's another pilot which hopefully kick off somewhere else soon. But it's very interesting to see how different countries have very different policy frameworks, very different objectives that they want to reach. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to ensure that the pathways deliver the values that these countries hold the same way that they deliver the values we have here in the UK and through the Environmental Improvement Plan here in England. But definitely this is something we want to take up, and we'll be doing a lot of work around this at both COP17 in Armenia as well as COP31, and engaging governments to socialize this as a potential solution for them to mobilize finance.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in on that at all, on applicability? No, all happy? Good. Okay. So then there's an interesting question here, I think, that says private sector investment requires private sector returns. And where are these returns coming from? A simple but very, very important question. And one that I think is really important to kind of address up front, is that if you imagine all of the actions that could be within a pathway, this is why the business viability analysis is so important, because some of those might make sense for business from a financial perspective, so have a positive return on investment today. Some of them might not. And for the ones that might not, this is why we need to be thinking through what is the changes that we need to the policy and the financial environment to in order in order to make sure that businesses have the right incentives to actually take those actions, to make these investments, and therefore for financial institutions to come in behind them and start financing some of that as well. And so this really isn't kind of a dogmatic exercise to say this sector needs to do this next sector needs to do this. It's a shared vision to say this is one pathway of what it could look like to achieve the target. And if we want that to be a reality, here's the changes that need to happen in order for it to make sense for all of the parties involved. So I think it's a really important distinction there to make, that this is as much about incentives as it is about making sure we have the right actions that ladder up to meet the targets. On that note, I'm afraid we have come to the end of the time that we have for today's webinar. So thank you so much to all of the team and the panelists that have joined us to help kind of elucidate some of the detail in the report today. Thank you to all of you for joining us online. Please do have a look at the methodology report if you haven't already. It's published and it's live now. And as always, we're always open to comment and feedback. So please feel free to reach out to any one of the team if you'd like to let us know what you think or have further questions. And with that, thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.